sustainably do. Both sustainably do. Both do sustainably. Both do sustainably. Both begin at identification. Both end at production. Ending. I'll start at the end. Fabric, material, used material, that surrounds in order to trap heat. Yes, trapping heat. An eternal need, an eternal requirement for life is trapping heat. So, building materials, be they for clothing, be they for building, be they for even for food, would be trapping warmth, I should say, not trapping heat. Heat can't be trapped. Well, a person can't trap heat, but a person does already trap heat. But what a baby knows, an infant knows, is that someone else, each body is warm, and so trapping warmth is what sustains life. Divine masculine brings divine feminine. Divine masculine puts down, divine feminine picks up. And that is where production, that's the beginning of production. That's the very that's the very beginning of production. Ultimately, production is the balance of both of those things, putting down and picking up, because divine feminine is understanding that the only reason why they pick up is so that someone else puts down, and divine masculine understands that the only reason they put down is because someone else picks up. Let's take clothing, right? I love fashion that is not going to irritate me, fashion that's not going to constrict me, fashion that won't choke me, fashion that won't cause muscle atrophy. I don't like stitching. Fashion that is all cut up, fashion that is reduced into tiny scraps of fabric that are not large enough to take apart. Right? A tiny piece of fabric that is this big, like a piece of clothing that is all stitched together from these small pieces of fabric that have been cut up, that is the least sustainable, because future creatives, be they male or female, could not take that stitching away and then trap warmth, because the fabric is so small. So part of divine feminine is picking up and identifying other person, like they don't that identification is cascaded from what divine feminine holds such love for, which is the shape, which is variety of skin tone, variety of body fat composition, body fat patterns, hair texture, all those things. Ultimately, this is about sustaining life and not causing muscle atrophy. So stitching provides rigid structural support that bone provides in the first place. Each body is already structurally supported by rigid bone. Stitching that stitching in between fabrics that are cut into such tiny pieces that when someone tries to, extend their armpit, and then that extension is limited, that will cause muscle atrophy. And you know who that is making rich? That's making doctors rich. We're trying to eliminate the need for medical doctors. And that's what divine masculine and divine feminine achieves. So sustainable means eternal. Eternal is sustainable. And that would be fashion that can be taken by future creatives, because you have to remember that each body, you have to remember that each body builds the body of the self from the time of the womb and after. Even after sexual maturity, right? The body regenerates, and so there needs to muscle atrophy is not part of an eternal sustainability. So me personally, I've eliminated stitching from my walking fashion. I I remember the comfort that a stitched quilt, a true quilt, not a quilt with fabric that has stitching in the middle of it. Oh, fabric with stitching in the middle, interrupting the beautiful draping and texture and flow of fabric. That's not rigid. Bone is rigid. So a true quilt is the joining of these small pieces of fabric that someone can lay on top of themselves, stitchless. Okay, person themselves is wearing no stitching because person is already structurally supported by rigid bone. But having a nice quilt over with no stitching in the interrupting fabric that has been so beautifully produced. So, where does divine masculine begin and divine feminine begin? They begin with identification. Divine masculine, with no cue, identifies what could be what factors into eternal production, eternal recreation. That's what I mean by future creatives. Being able to take fabric that has already been loved, already been well worn, that's not all cut into tiny pieces so that it's absolute rubbish to a future denizen. And where does divine feminine begin? Divine feminine also begins with identification. Identification of what is loved, of what is cherished, of what is beautiful, which is the natural diversity of physical need. Autistic people are so diverse, and autistic people are extremely irritated by stitching. An autistic person does not need rigid structural support of stitching. No, autistic person builds bone, creates bone on their own, and they are clothed or not clothed. Autistic person will be mobile and be able to move around without trapping them, without chaining them with stitching, without that rigid stitching. It's not compatible with bone structure. Okay, bone structure is divine. It's self-creation, self-support, self-structuring, and to honor that rigid bone structure that is already there, there's no stitching required for that. Okay, resting at night with a quilt on top with no stitching in the middle of fabric, but rather stitching that joins fabric that can be pulled and tugged with no resistance of the with no fat with no resistance being experienced by the fabric itself, that is ultimately experienced by autistic person, right? Not experienced but sensed, and then understood by without comprehension, but is known by autistic person to be totally unnecessary. Um, a true quilt with only stitching that is around the border of fabric, that is so comforting at night. But during the daytime, each body already has structural support and does not need to be constrained, does not need to be, okay, trapping warmth is different from stopping a person's range of mobility that is causing medical profit, that is causing medical wealth. It's not necessary. Not necessary at all.